So we've worked with Tom for a few years now at MAP. He's been a client of ours and someone that's always really impressed. And I think he comes from fairly rare case of MD that's been hired into an agency, which for a lot of small to medium-sized agencies is rare, because usually it's the founder that's running the business on behalf of the shareholders. But Tom did that. He's done it really successfully, and always been a pleasure for us to work with at MAP because of his organizational skills, his data skills, his ability to work with finance and to integrate it into the wider business as well. So Tom has been an MD for a long period of time. He had a long career before that as well. And we've got the benefit today of not just a lot of experience and knowledge, but a lot of experience and knowledge in the sector that most of you are in as well. So I hope this is going to be really useful and really relevant. So without further ado, I will pass over to Tom. I'm going to close down my camera and my mic, Tom, but I'll keep an eye on all of the chat and the Q&A, and I'll speak up if there's anything we'd like to raise.
Thank you very much for that, Paul, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to have a bit of a chat. Let me just share my screen just to check. Hopefully everyone can see that before I start. Can you see that, Paul?
All good, Tom, yeah.
Smashing. So, yeah, I think as just to kind of give you a little bit of an induction and a bit of a chat about me and who I am. So obviously, my name is Tom Fitzgibbons, and I am the founder of Caddy. So over the course of the last sort of 18 years or so, I've worked in various different sort of roles across sort of digital, retail and publishing, typically in sort of strategic and operational leadership roles in sort of data, marketing and IT. And then, as Paul mentioned, about 6 years ago, I decided to move agency side, hired into a sort of a digital agency that sort of specialised in design, sort of user experience and development. And while I was there over that sort of course of sort of 6 years, we had sort of real strong success, looking at how we scaled the business from about 30 people up to about 90 people. And in the end, operating across sort of 3 different territories. And we also very fortunate to be successful financially as well. I think we were in a position where by the end of it, we'd increase revenues by about 2.5x and profits by sort of a much larger number than that as well. And as Paul mentioned, it was during that time we came across MAP when we were out looking for sort of new accountants. And that's obviously where the relationship started. At the end of last year, I took a little bit of a decision to leave my role and ultimately set up Caddy with a view of sort of working in partnerships with other agencies to ultimately help them sort of fulfill their potential from that side of things. I think in terms of today, I think as the marketing that Paul sent out, here we're here to talk about how we can use data to help you sort of understand and scale your agency. There's a few things that we're going to cover from that perspective. The first one is, ultimately why data should be important to you and your agency. At its most simplistic, why should you care? What are the benefits and what are the motivations for you? We'll then have a little bit of a chat about time tracking. Why it's so important and critical to you as an agency. And most importantly, if you've got that time tracking data, what you should be doing with it. The next one will just be a little bit of a chat about clients and service profitability, working out how you can understand whether all of that effort that you're putting in working and servicing on clients actually delivers a return for you. Talking about how you can measure it, and ultimately, through that process of measuring it, how you can challenge your teams and ultimately drive action and make yourself and your business more sort of operationally efficient and all those sort of things. And then the final bit will just be a little bit of a chat about, how you can use your own data to understand more about your own agency, how it's performing, and looking at it from both a sort of an operational and a strategic point of view. As Paul mentioned, there'll be a Q&A at the end of it, and it should last around sort of 40 to 50 minutes from that side of things. Before we start, though, I just wanted to introduce you a little bit to this model that we've created at Caddy about how you can scale your agency. This has been born out a lot of our experiences over the last sort of best part of 20 years working in different environments, and something that we've used in different settings to sort of grow and develop those businesses as well. But obviously what we've tried to do, particularly with the experience over the last 6 years, is really adapt it to an agency world, an agency model, and really focus, on that specialism. And the reason why we created it is, from experience, we know that growing and scaling a business is hard. The transition from a small business to a medium-sized business is very, very difficult. And typically at the start of that journey, the founders do everything. And as you scale, it becomes increasingly more difficult to be everywhere. And typically founders are best suited and best placed to be working in your commercial function, so client services, new business, ultimately selling your products into clients, or leading your product or technical functions. And therefore there's limited time to focus on growth, and there's limited time to focus on how you achieve your goals. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to kind of create a model that was visual, that had some sort of core processes behind it, that we can work with people to help deliver. And as you can see from here, there's sort of 8 focus areas. The first one, is pretty simple in terms of your vision. What is it that you want to be? Where do you want to go? And what do you want to achieve, both personally and from a company perspective? The second section is about the strategy. How are you actually going to achieve that vision? How are you going to break it down into actionable tasks? That have timeframes, that have accountabilities, and how are you going to manage that effectively, like you manage your client projects, to make sure you have successful delivery. The next section, which is what we're here to talk about today, is obviously about the data side of things. As we said, understanding your performance, understanding client performance, looking at how you measure your progress against your vision, and how you can visualize issues and opportunities and drive change. The next 3, are the people, the process, and the technology elements, all interlinked and particularly pertinent when you're looking at how you operate and you scale your business. The people side of things, obviously hugely critical for agencies because they are our products. And obviously from this perspective, it's about having the right people in the right roles and how you develop high performing teams. The process side of things is how you can make things efficient and how you can operate your agency and how you can identify issues and opportunities, making sure it's fit for purpose, not just for today, but also in the future when you scale. And then finally, the technology side of things, obviously here is about ensuring that your teams have the right tools to do their jobs properly as you go. The penultimate, segment is about the client side of things. Obviously clients are our customers and it's critical that we look after them. So this is the marketing, acquisition, retention elements of it, looking at how you can kind of measure and increase satisfaction with your clients, and ultimately looking at how you can increase their value to yourself, and also the stickiness, so the amount of services, how embedded they are within your organization. And then the final one is the finance element, and obviously the majority of all of you here are working with MAP, so obviously you're in a fantastic place from that perspective. But from my side, it's all about how you work in partnership with them, how you can work with them to kind of create great financial results, not just for today but also in the future. Getting into some of those good practices around budgeting and forecasting, and some of the financial strategy around how you can grow your recurring revenues, grow your margins, improving your cash flow, and those sorts of good things, to make sure that you have a profitable and stable business that meets the needs of you and the rest of your team. But obviously, as I said, today we're here to talk about data, but obviously if anyone would like to know any further information about any of the stuff here, then obviously please feel free to get in touch. I think in terms of why data should be important to you and your agency, for me, data starts with the recording of something, and then once you start recording that information, what you're able to do is aggregate that stuff into a number, and then from a number you can start to put that into reports, you can start to look at trends, and then what you can really start to do is build insight. And by that I mean, how is your agency performing, and why is it performing? So, typically, obviously, we look at numbers and reports and things like financial metrics, revenue and profits, that sort of stuff, but also starting to think about some of the kind of the other non-financial metrics around things like your sales conversion rate, what your utilization rates are, what percentage of your products are delivered on time. Because once you start to look at those numbers and those metrics, what you can start to understand is, like I say, what is the trend? Are those numbers going up? Are they going down? And how does that vary from what I was expecting and what I'm trying to do as a company? And most importantly, like I say, why? And that's the most important thing. Why are these numbers showing me certain things? And like I say, what is driving it? Because I think once you know what an issue is or what an opportunity is and why it's happening and the insight behind it, ultimately, as directors and as leaders, what we can do is we can make better, more informed decisions. We can start to understand if there is an issue, is it a priority, for example, and if so, what action we're going to take and what we're going to do, or is there an opportunity that we should be following, and also how can we get the team on board, how can we do more of what's working, and how we can make sure that we're doing the right things for ourselves and our teams. And if you're starting to make better decisions, then ultimately what you're starting to do is you're starting to deliver more improved operations. And by that, I mean, improved outcomes, improved performance, better efficiencies. Because ultimately, by making those better decisions, you're making good decisions about what you're going to do. And obviously, sometimes not everything you do will work. But I think the key thing in all of this is, when you're changing something in your business, you want to be able to measure it. You want to be able to see and challenge yourself with, did it work? And did you make the right decision? Because if you did, great. How can we do more of it? How can we keep doing those sort of things? But if it's not working, what you want to do is obviously be in a position where you can understand that and revert back to your previous operating model, for better word. The other thing that greater insight can drive particularly is starting to think about how you can feed that sort of numbers, those reports, and that insight into your strategy, and where you want to go as a business. How do we improve our business as a whole? What are the key issues? What are the key opportunities for us? And that might be things like we have low customer satisfaction and actually we want to increase that. Or it might be we have low team satisfaction, and how do we want to improve that? Or we're looking at how we want to improve our profit margins. Using our data to start to inform our strategy and the direction of ourselves as a business, to make sure that we're using that data, monitoring and tracking issues and opportunities, and creating direction that we can then measure our progress against and drive change. Because ultimately, when you do all of those sorts of things, when you have greater insight and better decision making, improved operations, and a more informed strategy, what you're able to do is drive better business results. And obviously, that's why we're all here. All of those sorts of things allow us to make more profit, and look at how we ultimately deliver a better business. And I think the critical thing to think about throughout all of this stuff is it's not about finding that one key lever that's going to change everything. From the experiences that we've had, quite often you're looking for 5 or 10 things that just increase things by 1 or 2%. And obviously those percentage points soon start to add up, particularly at sort of a profit margin level, and start to make a real sort of difference to yourself and your business. Right. And I think when we talk about data, as I said at the start, one of the most important bits of data to me is the tracking of time. Because for me, people and time are our products, and unless we understand them and make effective use of them, we may never be able to fulfill our potential. Quite often when you're an agency, you'll send out a statement of work to a client, so what's been sold, but without that time tracking, you don't actually know what's being used. And to use a really poor analogy, it's like a retailer selling you a bottle of wine, but but then not really knowing how many bottles of wine you've actually taken out of the shop. So what you're trying to do is close that loop and make sure that you have that sort of enabler for growth and for understanding, and that you're able to drive long-term sustainable growth by understanding what your teams are doing. And I think it's important to say that time tracking is a journey. And it's likely that everyone on this call is at slightly different points in that journey. Some may not be collecting time data at all. Some may be collecting them but not doing anything with them. Some might be reporting on their time tracking data, and some might be reporting on it and then driving that real actionable change and drive. And for me, that's the most important thing, and that's why time tracking is so important, because when you're measuring time, you're able to create a huge range of benefits for yourself and your agency. And the first one is, looking at the start of the process, and getting more accurate statements of work. I think when you're tracking time, what you're able to do is be more reflective of how long things actually take. You're able to limit your potential overages, and you're able to minimize the amount of free work given away. And that might be in one or two different areas. So, accurate estimations, making sure that when you're quoting something at 5 days, you do actually know that it takes 5 days, or that it takes 10 days. And what you're doing is you're using that history and those actuals rather than guesstimates and gut feels to do things. You're also able to start to validate risk a little bit better when you've got time tracking. So, thinking about it, there's always one client who maybe is a little bit more difficult or a little bit more challenging, or maybe there's some technology that's a little bit more difficult to use. And actually, if you can start to quantify that risk, and you can start to understand that client A generally takes 10-15% longer than client B, you can start to build that contingency into your statements of work, again, to make sure that you are being more reflective of what's happening. The other side of things is also validating some of those assumptions. Typically when you're doing statements of work, I'm sure a lot of agencies have that, we'll add 10% on for project management, or we'll add 15% on for quality assurance, or something along the lines of that. Actually starting to be able to validate whether that is a realistic number, or whether there is a different number that is more reflective of what it should be, and making sure that you can pull all of that stuff together. The next area is about better project delivery. I think when you have that time tracking, what you are able to do is make sure you get your projects delivered on time and on budget, and you're really limiting the amount of overrun that you've got, and maximizing the profitability of projects. I think here time tracking really helps with giving you visibility of how well projects are being run and where they are, but also giving it to your project management team. And actually, it's a really transparent way to have honest conversations with your team as to whether projects are being delivered on time, whether there are issues or risks. I think time tracking really does help you understand something that I call time sponges. So bits of work that really just soak up time, soak up resource from the team. Whether that be through things that are technically complex, whether that be that certain members on the team maybe aren't quite suited to that bit of work, or whether it be actually scope creep from the client. You really can get that visibility, and you can get huge visibility also in terms of blockers of things that are stopping the project going forward. The next area is about efficient resource management. And when I talk about that, what I mean is maximizing the potential of the team and the potential profit and the revenue that you're able to generate. And that's by limiting the time that your team spends essentially sat on the bench, not earning fee revenue, through increasing their utilization rates and the amount of time they spend on client work. Here, time tracking is really important to help you start to identify bottlenecks in your team, whether that be process issues, whether that be people issues, and maybe even start to challenge you and say, we need additional resource. It's also great at helping to identify capacity in terms of the short and the midterm, and start saying, actually, here are people who are being underutilized for a consistent period of time. And then that helps drive conversations in terms of your new business revenues and also your client services teams, and might even start giving those questions about should you start discounting in order to drive some sales through. It's also a great tool at helping you understand maybe whether you're running with too many people in certain teams, and whether they need to be reassigned to do different tasks in your business. The final bit in terms of resource management is also about the people side of things. I think with effective time tracking, what you can start to do is start to view poor performance within your team, but also exceptional performance, people who are really adding huge value to yourself and your business. And then from a sort of a health perspective, also identify those people who might be at risk of burnout. You know, if you've got individuals who are working on client work, high utilization, 80, 90% perhaps, working more than their contracted hours every single week, then actually there's a chance that that individual is at risk of burnout. So you're using that data to help your team and make sure that you're keeping them fit and healthy. The next one, which we'll talk about in a bit, is around the sort of the improved client profitability. And then the final section on that is around improved forecasting and planning. And by that, I mean looking at how you can use your time tracking to help inform the future. So things like capacity plans is the big one. So looking at how you can use a combination of people, their roles and their rate cards, and using real information around their timesheets and their utilization rates to then start to model and forecast your revenue in the future. And it's a great way to understand your revenue potential, but it's also a great way to start thinking about how you can model your recruitment and see how those levers work. Now, to help, what we've done is we've created a couple of sheets. Hopefully everyone can now see this spreadsheet instead. Paul, I'm hoping you can.
Yeah, got it.
Cracking. So this is just a timesheet report, and this is what I sort of mean by looking and working out how you can track that time. I'm always a keen believer in putting things like targets in place. So what target do you want your team to be timesheeting? How much of their time do you expect them to log? What percentage do you want them to be utilized on client work? And from here, what you can then start to do is say, actually, for each employee, what's their rate card? What team do they sit in? And start to work out, out of their total hours worked, how many were maybe sick, how much time was spent working on client work to give you that timesheet percentage, and then how much was spent on billable work to look at their utilization rates. So here what you're saying is out of their 35 hours, and this is all complete dummy data, they worked 35 hours, 26 of those hours was on stuff that was sort of excluding sickness. So actually they've only logged 76% of their time, but of that 26 hours, 23 is on billable work. So their utilization rate is 88%. But then what you work out is their billable rate is 67%. So actually you're losing money, potentially in this instance of £234 a week, but you're losing that amount of money, and you're quantifying the amount of revenue that you're losing from those low utilization rates or those low timesheet rates. And what you can then start to do is aggregate it up by team. So actually you're not just looking at an employee level, you're looking at different team levels. So what you're able to do is understand where you're driving the most revenue from that perspective, and maybe which are the best teams and the best areas to do that from. And there's another one, and for some reason my screen is now I've lost it. Let me present the other one. And then the other area that we were talking about is around capacity planning. And again, like I say, this is where I've used time data and time tracking to really start to inform your business. So again, there's some simple numbers here at the top. How many days are there in a year? How many days do you expect people to have annual leave? And therefore, how many working days are available? And then you can start to use your information around, well, what percentage of time do you think people are going to be timesheeting? But from here, what you can start to do is start to create that model that says for each employee, what are their utilization rates? Because you know that from your timesheet analysis. And you can then start to build up models that say, well, actually, if, maybe we'll use employee two is working 40% of the time on billable work, you can then start to build up a model that looks at all of the revenue you might be able to generate. And again, looking at that by team, by role. So what you can start to do is build that information up. And the reason why I put these start and end dates in is then you can start to look at what happens if you add additional roles. What does that do to your overall model to make sure that you're continually looking at your revenue capacity and your revenue potential in the future. And now So the next one is just a little bit of a chat around sort of client profitability. And, here, what I'm talking about essentially is, as I've always phrased it, is the juice worth the squeeze? Ultimately, are you getting out something for all of that effort you put in? And obviously it's one of the biggest challenges for agencies to try to understand that. And I think it's important to say that probably clients shouldn't be judged solely on profitability, but at the very least, what you do want to understand is whether they're adding something to you and your business. And I think the critical thing to caveat here is, in order to understand client profitability and service profitability, the data quality is essential, because what you're trying to do is knit together different systems and different bits of data, which we'll talk about in a bit, together to kind of create that analysis. Now, obviously, you might be in a position where your agency is running certain program and project management tools that will do this stuff for you. Alternatively, you might not have those systems, in which case there's obviously the option of looking at how you can export all of that data out and manipulating that, in Excel or Google Sheets or whatever that might be. Ultimately, all businesses are different, but I think the principles of what we're talking about here are going to be the same. And I think, as I said earlier, unless you're doing that time tracking, you're going to have a real issue, because timesheets are an essential part of understanding client profitability, and without them, in all honesty, you're not going to get an accurate view whatsoever. Now, the first sort of 3 sections of this diagram that we're going to talk through, I will say, are not essential for understanding client profitability and service profitability. But what I would say is they're a great enabler. They're a great bit of best practice. And I think they really help you understand your overall agency performance against your targets, and makes you really start to think about the importance and value of each client that you get in advance. The first one is a nice and simple one. It's starting to think about your revenue budget as an agency of what you want to be generating each year. And the reason why that's important in terms of this client and service profitability is, once you've got a revenue budget, what you also want to start thinking about is your client budget. So how much revenue do you think each client is going to generate at the start of the year? Obviously on the assumption that your revenue budget is equal to all of your client budgets, plus probably a provision for sort of new business and all of that sort of thing. The next one, and again, I'm a massive advocate of this, is then starting to build out a forecast for each client. Because I think when you're starting to forecast every month how much revenue you think you're going to get from each client, taking into account what's happened in the past, but also taking into account your statements of work that you've got in, the current pipeline and any sort of known assumptions and all those sort of things, you're in a really good place to start asking questions back to your client services and your commercial teams about what's changed. Why is it different? Why is your forecast different to your budget? And like I say, what's changed over time? It's also a great tool that we'll then use, a reference point, that we can then use as we go through the analysis to keep kind of going back to our forecast, just to make sure that the operations of our business are working sort of smoothly and effectively. We then start going into how we actually start to kind of get the data, and we start to measure that client and service profitability. And, and more often than not, that will start with a statement of work. And simplistically, that's what has been sold to the client, and how much are they paying for that. And typically that is a combination of 3 factors. That's a combination of sort of a role, for a better word, maybe a director, a rate card, so how much are you charging on a daily basis for that, and the number of days, so effort. And those are the 3 things that will continue throughout the whole analysis of what you want to join together to make sure that you're kind of understanding what happens. Once you've got that statement of work, typically you go into that resource allocation. So the client signs something off, you then need to book in that resource to kind of make the machine churn out the work. And resource allocation, by that, like I say, I mean, what resource has been booked in your internal system to deliver that work? And again, what you're probably looking at is that combination of role, rate card and effort. And obviously it's probably down to an individual person of who's going to do that work as well. And what you can start to do here is start to get a little bit more granular in your analysis, and again, challenge your teams to make sure that they're working efficiently and they're following your processes. Because here, I'm again a big advocate of starting to compare things. What you want to do is you want to compare your resource allocation with your statements of work, but you also want to compare your resource allocation with your forecasts, and start to look for those variants to say, why is one bigger than the other? Because they should be the same. It may be, for instance, that your statement of work is overpriced, or maybe it's underpriced, and actually your resource allocation is different to your statement of work, and that's the reason why. It may be that you've got a statement of work, but maybe your project management teams aren't booking the right resource or the right level of resource in their resource allocation, in your resource allocation tool, and actually that's creating problems for you in the future. It may be that you've got certain project managers who like to hoard resource, as I call it, and by that I mean secure an extra 20 days work, or book an extra 20 days of resource just in case their project isn't delivered on time. And whilst that's great for their individual project and potentially their delivery, what that does do is completely change the complexity of your resource capacity, and starts to make your overall business potentially look less profitable. Resource allocation is a great way of also looking at sort of backdoor scope creep, where the client maybe speaks to your client services team or your project management team and just says, oh, can we just have this little change? And you book 1 or 2 days extra, and maybe it's not getting recharged properly. But it's always a good way of starting to kind of understand that. Or it may just be that the work is taking longer than expected. And again, the sooner you can understand the amount of resource allocation you're putting versus a statement of work, the sooner you can have those conversations with your clients and really manage those expectations around maybe when things are going to get delivered, or potentially if there's an additional cost. The nuts and bolts of it is then starting to look at how much time the team have actually spent on a project. And I think there's 2 things to do here. One is to always review a project at the end of it to say, actually, we said it was going to be 20 days, it actually took 25 days, and start to understand that in some sort of retrospective. But another great tool, and one that we've used frequently, is looking at midway through the project. So looking at how much time has been spent up to a point, but then also looking at the amount of time that's allocated in the future to get that live sort of forecasted view of how much time you think you're going to spend. Again, it's a great way of enabling conversations earlier with your team, but also with your clients about potentially cost, but also when things might get delivered. And again, here, you really want to be challenging your teams around, looking at that data of time spent versus resource allocation versus the statement of work and your forecast, to understand what's going on from your perspective. Is it simplistically your teams aren't logging your time correctly? Is it that there's some different phasing in how the project's being sort of delivered that maybe hasn't flowed through to the forecast or through to your resource allocation that you need to take into account? And then you need to look at maybe how you do some work in progress work, so how it hits your accounts. Or it might just be quite simply that your teams are just completely ignoring their resource allocations and working or going rogue and working on something completely different. But what you want to do is start to understand how these things knit together from that perspective. And again, like I say, continually challenge your teams. The final layer of it is then the invoice. So from here, how much time is the client being invoiced for? Again, you're looking at those same 3 variables of role, rate card, and effort. And here you want to compare, the invoice to the time spent, to your forecast and your statements of work, just to make sure that everything's lined up. The amount of times I've sat in meetings where you're sending an invoice that isn't reflected in your forecast, it's not conducive or helpful to working out how to manage your business and run your business. Is it that actually you've got a massive forecast and the invoice hasn't been sent? Again, I'm sure everyone's been in a situation where an invoice hasn't been sent for 2-3 months because it's been forgotten. You want to start to create reports that allow you to see that sort of stuff and give you visibility when that's happening. Or again, it may just simply be a case of you've spent a load of time on a bit of project, but you can't invoice it because it was a fixed price project. And therefore you want to start to understand whether you've overbilled for a bit of work or maybe you've underbilled for a bit of work. Because that all leads together to your recovery rates. And to me, this is the key metric at the end of it all. and at a sort of a simplistic calculation, what you're looking at is summing up the total the total monetary time spent on a project, dividing it by the total monetary amount of invoices that you've got. So it's that calculation of the percentage of time that you've spent on a bit of work that you've successfully invoiced for. And ideally, again, you want to look at two things. You want to look at an individual discrete piece of work, but what you also want to do is look at it over a period of time, and understanding maybe how profitable that client is, because it will then take into account some of those nuances and all those sort of things that you might get with sort of one-off bits of work. Simplistically, if your recovery rate is less than 100%, you're giving away unplanned work for free. If your recovery rate is greater than 100%, you're generating incremental revenue for time that you haven't spent. Whilst every business is going to be different, if you've got a recovery rate over 90%, then you're doing very, very, very well. But then, conversely, if you've got a recovery rate of less than 60%, then again, maybe as a business, whilst all are different, you need to start thinking about, actually, is this a keeper of a client? Do we want to improve them, or do we look at how we can kind of send them, for better word, to the departure lounge? And if you've got all of this information together and you're able to kind of weave it all together and stitch it all together, there are lots of other things that you can start to think about. If you know the recovery rate for each client, then what you can start to do is understand the recovery rate for your business as a whole. If you also offer multiple different services, you can start to look at the recovery rate for each service by each client, but also as a business. And then you can start to understand that actually service A is a lot more profitable than service B. So how do we do more of service A? And again, if you know that service A for clients A, B, and C are really, really good, how do you do more of that? How do you attract more of those clients into that specific service to help you make more profits? If you also have all this information, you can go another step further as well. You can start to use this information, use all of the stuff you've got, and work with the guys at MAP to feed that time information into your accounts and start to create a full P&L, taking into account any sort of fixed costs or things like hosting, etc., to really understand a full P&L by each client. Again, what I've got, let me find it, I'll share this tab instead. It's just a little bit of a view of how I've looked at client performance in the past and how it kind of stacks out. So as I talked about, being in a position for every client, you can see the budget, you can see the forecast, and you're able to measure that variance. You're able to see the allocation of how much resource you've booked in your systems, and you're able to see the amount of time spent. And again, always looking at those variances. And you're able to see how much time you've invoiced. And again, those variances, again, this is all false data, but in this example, if you've invoiced only £9,000, but your forecast is saying £12,000, then your forecast isn't correct. And again, you're probably over forecasting how much revenue you might make, which means that your end of year numbers are probably going to be lower than you thought, and you're not going to be as successful as you thought. And then this is the number at the bottom, that recovery rate, always looking at it. And again, like I say, these are false numbers, but what you see is there's variances every month, which is again why I'm really keen on always having this year-to-date number that allows you to kind of see how things are tracking over a specific period of time. Now, going back. The next slide is just a little bit of a chat about how important it is to also use your data to understand your own agency and your performance, both in terms of achieving your short and your long-term objectives. And by this, I'm not talking necessarily about just the financial metrics. What I'm talking about is operational and strategic level numbers, things that kind of allow you to understand historical performance of how your business has performed, things that look at your trends, and things that are like help you forecast and predict the future. Because ultimately, as I said a few times, when you know what's happening and you know the numbers, what you're able to do is understand them, you're able to discuss them with your teams, and you're able to drive better action and better change. And that's the stuff that gives us the best chance of achieving our objectives and ultimately being successful. And I think quite often it can be quite daunting to understand what to measure, how long it might take to do that sort of thing, what tools should you use, and what is the data telling me, and they're all completely valid questions. And I think something that's probably will take a little bit too long for this conversation, but happy to have a chat about those sort of things and help people. But I think it's really important to say that once you start and once you get into the rigor of doing this stuff, it shouldn't be a chore, and actually it should be a real enabler for you and your team. Because what you're able to do is you're able to share these numbers, you're able to share this insight, and distribute it with the teams in a meaningful and useful way, which helps keep them informed, but also drives real accountability, and drives high performing teams and better performance. Because I've always been a firm believer of, when you measure it, things change and things get done, and that's sort of a key thing to sort of live by. From my perspective, I sort of split numbers, particularly when you're looking at your own business, into two things. One is the sort of the strategic side of things, and one is the operational side of things. And when we're talking about the strategic side of things, for me, it starts with the vision. It's at a simplistic point of view. What do you want to achieve, and where do you want to go? From there, you obviously might be laddering on your strategy. How are you going to get there, and what sort of things are you going to do, both this year, in the next 3 years, and then beyond. And then once you've got your strategy, this is where the data side starts to kind of come in. Starting to think about, what are your objectives, what are your targets, how will you measure your strategy, and what does success look like? And from there, you can start thinking about key results. Start looking at time-bound objectives, which are typically quarterly, that help you meet your goals and make it a little bit more bite-sized and a little bit more feel more attainable. So thinking about it as an example, what you might have is your vision to be the UK's best agency in your specialism. Your strategy might be to be a recognised industry leader in your specialism, and therefore one of your objectives to achieve that might be about increasing inbound leads. But what you want to do is then, with your key results, start thinking about how you make that, like I say, more time bound. So that would then be maybe increase your inbound leads to 10 by the end of Q2 in 2023. I'm also then, going back to thinking about it, and we'll talk about this in a bit, a firm believer of making things visual. So once you've got your vision, your strategy, your objectives, and your key results, we would always advocate creating a balanced scorecard, which is a visual representation ultimately of your vision and your strategy and all of those key results and all of those objectives, to show and benchmark how you're performing. The other side is the operational side of things. And I think, again, it's really important to measure this stuff as well, as I've talked about. And this is the stuff that are focused on the day-to-day running of your agencies, the issues, the challenges that you face on a day-to-day basis. These are great things to kind of talk to your teams about on a one-to-one. And if you're not already having a sort of a weekly operations meeting where you can talk around the business, you can talk about your ability to hit this month's revenue target and ultimately make sure that everything's on track and you're pushing things through. From an operations side of things, we would tend to advocate splitting things into sort of a past, present and future model. So looking at metrics that describe everything that's going on. And again, always continue asking, why is this happening and how can we improve it? Past metrics might include things like, what was your timesheet percentage last week or last month? What was your utilization percentage last week, last month? What new work did you deliver? The present metrics are much more focused on your budgets, your forecasts. How much money do we want to deliver this month? How much have we invoiced? What are the variances to those numbers? How does that look like at a client level? Where are the shortfalls? Where are the incremental increases? Looking at where there is risks and issues in terms of your project delivery and what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. And then also looking at things like your resource capacity for this week. Where is their capacity? Where are their bottlenecks? How do we resolve that sort of stuff at an operational level? And then the future stuff is similar to the present, to be honest, but then you're looking further ahead. So rather than looking at the current month, what's happening in month +1, +2, +3, and again starting to think about your revenue budgets, your forecasts. What does your resource allocation look like? How much is filled? Where are there gaps versus the forecast? And ultimately be an opportunity to challenge and think about your client services pipeline and your new business's pipeline as well. As I talked about a little bit, a balanced scorecard should really align with your strategy. And the reason I'm a firm believer is it's a great tool of alerting you when your objectives and key results are performing above or below expectation, and really helps you achieve your vision. To me, it should be a holistic tool, and should focus on all areas of the business. I think quite often it's easy just to focus on the financial side of things, and actually you want something that's much more encompassing. And it definitely does work best when your teams and your individuals are given accountability for those metrics, not just as a number, but also how they can drive change. A balanced scorecard is a fabulous tool to sit alongside your financials in your board meetings, and it's also a great tool, as part of wider monthly, quarterly, whatever team meetings that can then demonstrate your progress to the teams. And I think the key with all of these things is, talking to the exceptions, what's above target, what's below target, and ultimately, again, why, what's the most important thing. The first quadrant of a balanced scorecard should always be the finance side of things. Ultimately, how well is your business performing against your financial metrics? They'll tip, your objectives and your OKRs, for a better word, typically come from your budgets. Obviously, the data tends to come via MAP. The sort of things you're looking here will be things like your revenue, your recurring revenue, recovery rates, net profit, cash flow, those sorts of things. You also want to, though, include some of the things around your clients, so your customers. Data that might come maybe from your invoicing systems or your project management tools, or maybe customer satisfaction surveys. What you're here, you're trying to measure two things. How do they feel? So things like their satisfaction, net promoter score, complaints, that sort of stuff. But also how embedded they are within your organization. Like I say, how many of the services that you offer do they use? What are your retention rates? What revenue is coming from new clients? What's coming from sort of like-for-like clients? So again, you can start to model and understand your business. The third quadrant is the people side of things. So metrics relating to your team and your people, how well they're being managed, how well they're being utilized, that sort of thing. And how well are they developing as people? So again, this stuff would typically come from your resource management tools or maybe your HR systems. You might be looking at things like utilization rates. You might be looking at team retention rates. You might be looking at overall team satisfaction, or maybe how many of them achieve their certifications or sickness, things like that. So trying to work out what those key people metrics are that you're looking to measure in order to help you achieve your vision. And then finally, there's the process side of things. So these are things that relate to how well your agency is running and how efficient you are at completing tasks. And this data could come from anywhere. It might come from your CRM, it might come from your project management tools. But, again, the sort of things you want to be thinking about are things like your inbound leads, your sales conversions, if you have SLAs and service credits, the breaches, those sorts of things. I think it's important to say that obviously balanced scorecards are going to be different for all agencies and all businesses, and also that it's a moving beast. What's important for you today in your vision might not necessarily be important tomorrow. What you want to do is make sure that you're continually updating your balanced scorecard to be reflective of the vision and the direction that your business is going on. But I think the key and the most important thing is to define what metrics help you achieve that vision, set targets for them, set dates, and also look at how you capture and report on them, and again, drive that change. And again, I've created a template which just kind of gives you an indication of how you look at it on a recurring basis. But like I say, what is the objective? What is the actual? What is the monthly target? And what is the variance? And again, I would probably always stick with quarterly targets, because I think if you start doing monthly targets, it does get quite time consuming. But looking at how you can measure those targets on a quarterly basis, monthly basis, and say, actually, are we performing above target? Are we performing below target? If you're above, great. Can we do more of it? If we're below, then actually, what do we need to do? What's the remedial action? How do we get this back on track, for a better word? And that's it, really. I think, in summary, for me, there's huge amounts of value that data can bring to your business. At its most simplistic level, it's about getting access to that data, including your time tracking data, getting into the rigors of how you can report on those numbers and how you can create insight and be able to challenge one another, and ultimately how you're able to drive action and change, both at an operational and a strategic level. I think if there's anything that people feel has struck a chord with them, obviously please feel free to get in touch. I'm including my email address and my LinkedIn page. I'm obviously just happy to have a chat or answer any questions you might have. And then conversely, if you feel there's anything that you need help with, obviously we'd love to hear from you. As we said at the start, our aim is to sort of help agencies fulfill their potential. And I think there's a range of things that we can offer, whether that be around your strategy and your vision, looking at how you can get more data and insight from your business, helping you scale up, or whether that be about delivering sort of operational and strategic initiatives, all the way up to sort of being fractional COOs or an operations director for the day. We can help with one-off engagements or recurring things. There's lots more in between. The links to the downloads that I've talked about, the Google Docs, are included in the template, and they'll be sent out later. Sorry. Otherwise, that's everything from me. I just obviously like to say thank you for listening. Hopefully, there's been one or two things that have been interesting for you and some value, and you've come away with a few things to think about. So yes, thank you very much for your time, and obviously, hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Tom. That was great. I've just got a couple of questions to fire at you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
You've answered the second one already, actually, which is, will the spreadsheet templates be shared with us? We will, Suzanne. Yeah, we'll send those out over email later, so you have access to the slides and the templates as well. And then Olivia has asked the question that you're probably expecting, which is about software.
Yeah.
Which is, are there any helpful time tracking tools you could suggest? So she used one called EverHour, but it was one of the clock things, stop and start clock, and the team would inevitably pop to loo or pop to make a brew and forget to hit stop. So whether you believe in that, I guess, as a tool, and whether you do or not, what you found was the best for you? I
think that my personal opinion is you need to find whatever is best for your team. So in lots of different roles, we've tried those sort of time tracking tools, but the best thing has always been about something that is integrated with your project management tool, and what they are working on. So if, I'll use Jira as an example because it's the one that I know the best. If all of your client work and all of your project work and everywhere that your team goes is in Jira, you should be using Jira as your time tracking tool, because ultimately all you're then doing is creating a distraction for your teams. They go somewhere else and things get lost.
Okay, yeah, I really like that, and obviously that's why there are so many different versions of the same thing, because there isn't one answer, there isn't one best of. People ask for the best time tracking tool, but it really does depend on what your other suite is of tools that you're using and your culture. So Jira might be the best for those that are using Jira for ticket support and that kind of thing, but you wouldn't recommend it normally as a standalone application if you're not using their suite.
No, I would, I think it's really difficult without understanding, each business, but I would recommend start with the tool that you've got and then work out, are there any plugins? If it doesn't do it natively, are there any plugins that you can integrate into it that then allow the teams to stay in one place? Because, as like you say, as soon as they go into multiple different places, things don't get tracked. And I think the big thing I would say about tools is the thing that worked best for us is not actually the tool, but is sitting down with the team and telling them why time tracking is important. What are the benefits? Why are we doing it? It's not to look through your timesheets and tell you've been a naughty boy. It's actually to sit there and go, we're doing this so we can understand whether clients are, whether we're driving real value for us as a business and we're generating revenue. And what we don't want you doing is spending loads of time on something we're not making any money on.
Yeah.
Because no team member wants to be working on something that's costing their business money.
Yeah.
Those benefits and driving the value and the understanding, I think, was the biggest thing that we found worked. And then failing that, in all honesty, it wasn't necessarily a tool. It was having one person who was accountable for chasing those timesheets on a weekly basis, and being, for better word, a bit of a battle axe and going, right, where's your timesheets? Because it's easy to forget. But just having that person whose essentially job it is to chase through that stuff.
Yeah. Strangely, Alice has just put some really considered questions up, and the first one was what I was about to ask you, which is, for those that are looking at all this thinking it's great but it's overwhelming, I know realistically I've got a big job on my hands and I've got a lot to do. You obviously put a lot of consideration into these tools and presentation and years of experience, but for somebody who just needs to walk before they can run and build momentum, not just in terms of time tracking, but in terms of all of this sort of data piece, what would be your recommended start point?
I think for me, the recommended start point is, like you say, is start simplistically. And, again, all businesses and agencies are different. But, when I started, as the managing director of a role, it was simplistically, start looking at creating a budget, creating a forecast for each client, and then understanding the amount of invoices you're sending out on a monthly basis. Because I think if you can understand what you thought you were going to get at the start of the year, how much you are expecting to get every month, and then compare that to an invoice, what you start getting into is that sort of behaviors of money, clients matter. And I think from there, you'll start asking questions of, why am I not invoicing what I thought I was invoicing? And it will start to create those questions.
Yeah. And
the next generation is the detail behind what the team doing on a Tuesday, at 3 p.m. But the most important thing for all businesses is the money going in the till. And actually, what you want to do is you want to get that at its most simplistic kind of sorted. And I think unless you have that budget and that forecast, it's very difficult to go, is this a good month? Is this what I was expecting?
Yeah. One of the tools that we use really successfully with our clients and for our own business is the revenue forecast. And the name probably doesn't do it justice. I've been saying this for a while because it's so much more than a forecast. Any good forecast is actually there to help you to do something about the facts rather than wait till after the event, isn't it? So the revenue forecast, we're saying, we're now in May, in June and July and in August, for example, the next quarter, what's our expected revenue on each of these projects, each of these clients? And then Alice mentioned weekly there. On a weekly basis, you're looking at it saying, what's at risk? What's at risk because we're running over, or because we've not done enough work, or because the invoicing milestones, what is at risk, so that we can try and do something about it now, rather than wait till after the event when it's too late. So it's more of it's not just a revenue forecast, it's a revenue tracker, it's a reconciliation to your accounts, it's account management, account planning, it's profitability and spending the right time on each job. But it's really about de-risking your business and de-risking your forecast by being able to proactively work with it every week.
And a great way of doing that is we always encourage our teams to create the invoices at the start of the month, leave them in draft, and then obviously you're talking through, going back to your point about risk, look at the ones that are for the most amount of money, and just continually every week make sure that they're going out. Because the amount of times people leave an invoice to the 31st of the month, then it gets bumped into the next month was too many to count. So what you're trying to do is, like you say, get that visibility. And like I say, I would always encourage creating the invoices at the start, as draft, and then just keep checking against them, like you say, to make sure that they are going.
Yeah. So Alex said she's working with David at the moment at MAP on creating a good forecasting system. So that's great, Alex. And as we've said, really start simple. You can build it up over time. We're still iterating ours all the time, and we've been using it for years, but you find more and more uses of it, breaking down portfolios and that kind of thing. Jamie has asked what a good recovery rate percentage might be.
That's the $1 million question. Like I say, I would say if your recovery rate is over 90%, you're doing very well. I think if your recovery rate's over 80%, you're doing pretty decent. You can accept clients probably if they're big enough on 70%, if it's 1 or 2 clients. But I think if you start to get clients that are below 70%, below 60%, you've really got to start questioning whether it's worth it. I was trying to work out whether it's tied something to do with your gross margin and your net margin, all those sort of things, because I'm sure there's a calculation that says actually if your recovery rates are less than your net margin or your gross margin, then you're losing money.
Yeah, we often talk about we'll talk about total salary cost being with less than 60% of your revenue. So like you said, if you're then recovering less than 60%, then by definition you're going to be loss making most of the time. But it does depend. It depends on your prices, and it depends on the cost of your team. But yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. If you look at it in that same way, so we talk about 60-20-20, 6% of revenue on staff cost, 20% on other cost, and 20% profit. But it's more about the model than the numbers, because every agency is going to be different in terms of one agency 60-20-20 might actually be 50-25-25. So look at your budget and look at your management accounts and see what those numbers come out as for you. But then that gives you a bit of an idea about the recoverability issue, because if it's 60-20-20, then anything under 80% recovery, technically you're going to be struggling to make a net profit, and anything under 60, you're not even going to be making a gross profit.
And I think, the thing that I would always encourage is, the amount of times we had conversations with clients to say, essentially, we're not making that much money on you and you're using a lot of free resource. More often than not, I'm not saying all the time, clients, if they're happy with your relationship, they don't want to be in a position where you are losing money and you're not making profit, because they want a fruitful partnership that works long term. So 100%. I think if you can understand it, then it's about having those good conversations. And again, it's about understanding. If you've got a junior on it who's taking far too long, then you need to obviously look at how you maybe exclude them. But there's if it is a genuine reason, then I think just have those good conversations. I think it's really important.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. It's a good way of testing whether they're as good a client as maybe you thought. Rita's asked, working on a lot of fixed cost projects, but we do have a rate card. However, these numbers are totally made up, and I don't know what we're actually charging per person per client. Will your capacity spreadsheet help with that?
So it's a very good question. So I think, again, most agencies have different rate cards for different clients. So I think the way that I would view the capacity spreadsheet is, what are your current rate cards, and therefore what is your theoretical revenue capacity? I think if you've got lots of different rate cards, you don't know. What I would try to do is settle and agree what your theoretical rate card is and what you would go out to sell people to if you could tomorrow, and then use those numbers, because I think that will tell you that actually your revenue capacity, let's say, is £1 million. But then what you then want to start to do is do a bit of an audit against all of your clients to work out how much they're paying, because what you might find is you're giving away 30% of your margin in discounts versus that rate card. And again, it's about having those good conversations with clients every so often to say, we need to increase your rates, because I think if you're always giving away more money on your rate card to clients, your margin's never going to get up to where you want it to be, and you're never going to fulfill that capacity. So the short answer is no, that spreadsheet won't help you, but it will give you what your capacity would be if you had a fixed desired rate card, and then it's how you get to that with all of your clients.
Yeah, and I agree, start at the top level. So if you've got something like a revenue forecast, revenue targets, then you're tracking the actuals and forecast against that target. If everything is thumbs up, we're tracking above our targets, which are built on the revenue capacity, you might not do as much digging as if you're falling short. And if you're falling short, you want to go a layer deeper and see how much of that is utilization versus how much of it is rates, and how much of it is certain personnel versus other personnel, or certain services versus other services. But I think if you start from the top level, that avoids you getting stuck in the weeds too quickly, and focus on what's important, which is the overall outcomes for you and your business. And then start to go deeper after that, I think, is the right way to do it.
I mean, I think just on that point, Paul, I think the big thing is also starting top level. Make sure that at a high level, the revenue that you've got budgeted, you can deliver with your capacity.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, if you can't deliver your revenue with your capacity, you either need to change your revenue, or you need to change your budget, or you need to hire as well.
Yeah,
so
completely, because your capacity planner is about your minimum acceptable revenue, really, for me. You don't want to restrict yourself by your revenue capacity. If you can do more than that, great. But it should be a sense check to make sure that your model actually works. Yeah. Super. Right. Thanks for staying on a bit later, Tom. I think we've answered all the questions. Yeah. So unless anybody speaks in the next 5 seconds, we will wrap it up there. Thank you, everybody, for giving us your time today. Hope it's been really useful. We will share the slides and links to all the different tools, both within the WhatsApp group and over email as well. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.